सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
These days we live in such polarized times that when a political event occurs, you can guess what the responses are going to be even before anyone actually responds. Let's take the example of the raid/survey on the BBC. It was clear to me what the left was going to say and what the liberals were going to say. All of them said fascist regime, out to get the media, no freedom of speech, how can we tolerate this, etc. And the right wing said we had to teach the BBC a lesson. It's, a colonial organization. They're white people. They can't get used to the idea of brown people doing well. So we have to act against them, especially as they're crooks. And the BBC are well-known international crooks. Now, all of this strains credulity somewhat, and yes, some of it comes from crib sheets. If you look at what the right said about the BBC, they were pretty much reading from a script. It's similar to the script that's now going around about George Soros. Ministers, right-wing ideologues, and I use the term lightly, have all said what an evil man George Soros is. They've tweeted links to obscure articles in obscure publications, all to prove that George Soros and the BBC are part of some campaign against the BJP. Now, I hold no brief for either side when it comes to this argument. I think liberals overdo the fascist regime stuff, and I think the right overdoes the white people are so jealous of us stuff, because Mr. Modi likes being nice to same white people when he goes to G20s or whatever. So it's not as black and white as the right would make it out to be. So let's look at the survey, if you want to call it that, at the BBC. Why did it happen? Well, the most often advanced explanation is that this regime has a way of taking its critics and charging them with economic offenses. Yeah, it never really says anything about the content of what they've done. It says they're crooks, it says they're foreign exchange violations, it says that they laundered money or whatever. So it would make sense, I think, for liberals and opponents of the government to say this is yet another example of the government using a so-called income tax type argument to punish the BBC for the documentary it did on the Gujarat riots. I can understand why they've said that, but I want to move away from this whole fascist versus evil colonialist argument. Let's not take sides. Let's be practical, let's be pragmatic. Let's look at what the government has done. Let's consider why it could have done it, and let's see whether it's going to work. So option one, which is the argument advanced by the government, is that these raids in which they seized telephones from the BBC's staff, which continued for over 2 days, were because the BBC had done something with transfer pricing, a concept most of us don't understand, which was illegal or violated Indian law. It may or may not be true, but I think most people would argue you don't take a thumbtack and hammer it in. You do it gently. There was no need for such a heavy-handed approach if the only argument was one of income tax evasion, or not even income tax evasion, income tax avoidance. If that was the argument, then surely this was overkill. So that's option one. Maybe that's why the government did it. Maybe the government has been completely sincere when it says it only did it as a matter of investigation, nobody is above the law, etc., etc. That's option one. Will it work? Well, yeah, I suppose so. If the BBC is doing some kind of tax avoidance, then maybe that tax avoidance will now end. Option two is that the government did this to punish the BBC because the BBC had broadcast a documentary on the Gujarat riots, and it's a documentary in which the Prime Minister came off badly. We know that the government didn't like it because the government protested. Various ministers said terrible things about the documentary. The government asked for the right of reply, which it was given. And if you look at social media, BJP trolls went for the BJP, the same stuff about white people can't see that we're doing so well, they're just colonialists, colonial masters, etc., etc., all this nonsense. And even British politicians don't agree with the BJP, and then they rehashed a lot of what opponents of the BJP and the Conservative Party had said about the BJP and about freedom of speech. So if they were doing it only to punish the BBC, which is certainly a possibility, judging by the way in which they have behaved until now, is it going to work? Well, my view is it isn't. It may make the government feel happy for a couple of days, but in the long run, it makes very little difference to the BBC. The BBC is not, as the government seems to think, some monolith where if you attack it for one thing, it realizes it won't do another thing again. The BBC comprises many different departments and many different people, headquartered in London but spread across the world. The people who were raided, who were made to give up their phones, were not really the people who made the documentary the government is upset about. The people who made that documentary were unaffected by all of this. They continue to sit in London or wherever, and they will continue to make documentaries. It's quite possible the documentaries they now make will be even more critical of the government than the original one which got the government so upset. If this was intended just to punish the corporation, I don't think that's going to work. And then, of course, there's option 3, which is that in India, because there have been so many threats of charges of economic offences, most newspaper proprietors may well be running scared. Certainly newspapers and now increasingly television channels are either controlled by people who support the BJP or people who are afraid of what the response of the government may be. So this threat of we will take action against you if you continue to oppose us has, though the threat is never made in so many words, it has actually been delivered quite nicely and subtly, and it's worked. I think most journalists are much more circumspect about what they would say. Most of the media treads quite carefully. Is that going to work with the foreign press? I don't think it is. I mean, contrary to what the government seems to think, what it's done to the BBC is nothing compared to what really dictatorial and despotic regimes have done. Journalists have faced all kinds of atrocities. They faced all kinds of terrible shutdowns, arrests, whatever. And no powerful regime, no authoritarian regime that has tried to shut down the Western press or global media has ever really succeeded. You may inconvenience a few people. The Russians, the Chinese have arrested individual journalists. But in the long run, it makes no difference. The media juggernaut rolls on anyhow. So the idea that just as you frighten Indian journalists, you might be able to frighten foreign journalists, I think is a mistake. So if you're going to look at it in purely pragmatic terms, which is what we're doing now, the example to go back to is Indira Gandhi. When Indira Gandhi came to office, she was very hostile to the Western media. Her rhetoric and the rhetoric of BJP trolls these days was not that dissimilar. All this stuff about colonial hangover, want to do us down, can't bear to see us succeed, still think of us as subjects, etc. All this stuff was used many, many years ago, 50 years ago. It got to the stage where in 1971, I think it was, the BBC screened documentaries by a French filmmaker called Louis Malle, who, as far as I could tell, was not particularly anti-Indian. But the government of India took the line that these documentaries were hostile to India. Mrs. Gandhi asked the BBC to stop showing the documentaries. Of course, they were never going to do that. And then, as a response, she threw out the BBC correspondent and had the BBC office in Delhi shut. You could argue, as many did at the time, that the documentaries were only an excuse. Mrs. Gandhi was actually very angry with the corporation for the way in which it had broadcast stuff about her government and about India, and wanted to throw the correspondent of the BBC out and wanted to ban it from India. Well, what happened? Mrs. Gandhi did all this in 71. Within a couple of years, she realized it had made no difference. It had made no difference to the coverage, and she allowed the BBC back in. Then came the emergency, and her censors and her officials and her bureaucrats and her policemen assumed a similarly heavy-handed approach. Foreign journalists were expelled, they were threatened, they were not allowed to function properly. Mrs. Gandhi said it was an international conspiracy to defame India. The foreign hand was brought up again. It didn't work, no? Mrs. Gandhi's foreign image didn't improve in the slightest. And in 1980, when she came back to power, she dispensed with all of this stuff. She gave interviews to everyone. She allowed foreign media to come to India. She spoke to them. Some of the criticisms remained. Some of the coverage was unfavorable. But I think she took the broader line that in the long run, this doesn't matter. I suspect that may be the position the BJP should take. In 1980, India was in a very different position from the position it is now in. India now is a country on the cusp of some kind of global greatness. It's a country that, as we've seen during the war in Ukraine, that both sides will court. The Russians have courted us. The Americans have courted us. They asked us to stop buying oil from Russia. We took the reasonable position, which is that whatever happened in Ukraine, which we probably disapproved of because we disapprove of invasions, the price for that shouldn't be paid by the poor of India. So we will get the best deal for our people whenever we can, wherever we can. And though America huffed and puffed, ultimately the Americans realized you couldn't mess with India. If you see the way in which the world is trying to make a beeline to India, the way in which the American, French, and British governments have reacted to the Air India order for Boeing, you realize that India is now too powerful a country for anyone to ignore. You see it in the way Mr. Modi is sought out at these global conferences he goes to. You'll see it at the G20 conference, which will be held in India. So India now is a strong country. It's a country whose foreign policy is its own. It's a country that the rest of the world respects. Should we care? Should we care about what some newspaper organization said? Should we get so angry about George Soros? Should we invent conspiracies against us? Does it really matter what we say or what we tweet? We are surely too big for that. It's, I think, something that the government should keep in mind. Yes, Mr. Modi is criticized by the foreign media, but on the other hand, he's courted by Biden, he's courted by Sunak. He's where he wants to be. He is being accepted as a global statesman. Yes, the media will attack him, the foreign media in particular, but it doesn't help to threaten them. It doesn't help to punish them. It'll just make things worse. Learn from Indira Gandhi. Recognize that India is now on the cusp of greatness. It's a country that nobody can ignore. Mr. Modi is a statesman who nobody can ignore. And surely that should be enough.